By early 1944, the strategic landscape on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively against Nazi Germany. The Red Army's series of offensives, initiated after the victory at Stalingrad and amplified during the Battle of Kursk, had forced Army Group South into a prolonged retreat across Ukraine. The German 1st Panzer Army, under Generaloberst Hans Valentin Hube, found itself increasingly isolated following the Soviet Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which began in December 1943 and continued through the spring of 1944. The German forces in the region, numbering approximately 200,000 men, were spread across the western Ukrainian countryside between the Dniester and the Carpathians, defending a front that had thinned after repeated withdrawals and heavy casualties. Their positions were anchored on key urban centers such as Proskurov, present-day Khmelnytsky, and Kamenets-Podolsky, present-day Kamenets-Podolsky. But the strategic depth to their rear had diminished significantly. For the Soviet Union, the winter and spring offensives aimed to destroy the remnants of Army Group South and liberate western Ukraine, thereby opening the path toward the Carpathians, Hungary, and Romania. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev coordinated the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, supported by over 450,000 troops, 5,500 artillery pieces, 600 tanks, and self-propelled guns, and around 500 aircraft. Their objective was not only to seize territory, but to encircle and annihilate German forces by exploiting their extended lines, limited mobility, and shortages of fuel and ammunition. Intelligence assessments indicated that the Wehrmacht's armored divisions were significantly depleted, with most panzer regiments reduced to fewer than 60 operational tanks each, and infantry divisions averaging 50% of their authorized strength. Soviet planners assessed that a rapid pincer movement, cutting off the German 1st Panzer Army from other elements of Army Group South, could neutralize the force in a matter of weeks. The German High Command, led by Generalfeldmarschall Erich von Manstein of Army Group South, recognized the vulnerability but faced constraints. The 1st Panzer Army's divisions, including the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions and several infantry corps, held defensive positions along a 350-kilometer front. Their total armor counted fewer than 200 operational tanks, supplemented by a similar number of assault guns and self-propelled guns. Supplies were limited due to constant Soviet air attacks on transport hubs and partisan activity disrupting rear area logistics. Despite these challenges, Hitler's directive forbade a full withdrawal behind the Dniester, instead demanding that German units hold key cities as fortresses to delay Soviet advances. This decision left Hube's army exposed, with minimal reserves and diminishing escape routes. Public sentiment in both countries reflected the stakes of the campaign. For the Soviet Union, the liberation of Western Ukraine carried symbolic importance, demonstrating that the Red Army could reverse the devastation inflicted since 1941. Soviet propaganda highlighted the operations as a continuation of the victories at Kursk and Kiev, promising the destruction of the Wehrmacht in Ukraine. In Germany, state media downplayed the deteriorating situation, presenting Hube's army as a bulwark protecting Europe's southeastern flank. However, internal communications within the Wehrmacht noted that morale was fragile. Many divisions reported growing desertion rates among non-German auxiliaries and severe fatigue among infantry units, particularly after months of winter combat with minimal reinforcements. By March 1944, the stage was set for one of the most consequential encirclement battles of the war. Soviet forces had massed along a 400-kilometer front, aiming to encircle Hube's 1st Panzer Army near Kamenets-Podolsky by executing converging attacks from north and south. German forces, outnumbered by roughly 2-to-1 in manpower and nearly 3-to-1 in armor, prepared to defend a position that was rapidly becoming untenable. Both sides understood that the coming weeks would determine whether Army Group South could maintain a coherent line in Ukraine or suffer a catastrophic loss, comparable to Stalingrad. In early March 1944, the Soviet High Command launched the opening stage of what would become the encirclement at Kamenets-Podolsky. On 4th March, the First Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Zhukov, began a large-scale assault against the German Intense and XXXXXI Panzer Corps positioned near Proskurov. These corps, forming the northern hinge of Hube's defensive line, consisted of about 70,000 men, supported by fewer than 90 operational tanks and assault guns. The Soviet spearhead, led by the 1st Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army, committed more than 300 tanks and self-propelled guns in the initial push, supported by concentrated artillery barrages that employed over 1,200 guns. The Soviet objective was to break the northern sector, seize Proskurov, and advance westward to sever the primary supply routes leading toward the Dniester and Carpathians. The initial Soviet breakthroughs came swiftly. By 6th March, forward elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army had penetrated over 20 kilometers into German positions, exploiting gaps left by retreating infantry regiments that had been depleted to half their strength. Proskurov became the focal point of the fighting. The German garrison, consisting largely of the 359th and 371st Infantry Divisions, mounted a stubborn defense, delaying Soviet armor long enough to allow other elements of the 1st Panzer Army to begin consolidating their lines to the south. The city fell on 9th of March after a week of urban combat that destroyed much of its infrastructure, effectively cutting off the northern escape corridor for Hube's army. Simultaneously, the Second Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Konev, initiated its drive from the southeast. Beginning on 5th of March, the 40th and 52nd Armies, supported by the 2nd Tank Army, advanced toward the Dniester crossings near Mogilev-Podolsky. These units, numbering roughly 180,000 troops with around 250 tanks, aimed to secure bridgeheads and prevent the 1st Panzer Army from withdrawing southward into Romania. The Soviet advance was met by elements of the German Force and LII Corps, whose combined strength had been reduced to approximately 60,000 men with fewer than 50 tanks between them. The Germans, lacking significant reserves and facing constant Soviet air harassment, were forced into a fighting retreat toward the river crossings. The coordination between Zhukov and Konev tightened the encirclement. By 18th March, Soviet forces advancing from Proskurov in the north and Mogilev-Podolsky in the south had closed a gap of less than 60 kilometers between their spearheads, creating a narrowing corridor around Kamenets-Podolsky. Hube's 1st Panzer Army, now compressed into an area roughly 100 kilometers across, faced imminent encirclement. Within the pocket were 18 German divisions, including 4 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, several infantry divisions, and corps-level support units, all collectively numbering around 200,000 men. Their armor inventory stood at roughly 150 operational tanks and assault guns, many of them short of fuel. The German command responded by consolidating defensive positions around key towns such as Kamenets-Podolsky, Dunayevtsi, and Chortkiv, while attempting to maintain open supply corridors along secondary roads and river crossings. Generaloberst Hube, aware of the risk of encirclement, advocated for an immediate breakout to the west before the Soviet pincers could fully close. However, Hitler's insistence on holding Kamenets-Podolsky as a strong point forced the army to delay its withdrawal, further endangering the encircled forces. Soviet reconnaissance reports indicated that by 20 March, only 2 narrow supply routes, both under constant artillery and air attack, remained open to the trapped German formations. The opening phase concluded with Soviet forces firmly controlling the approaches to the Dniester and having severed the primary railway links that sustained the 1st Panzer Army. The German units, though still cohesive, were now almost entirely dependent on dwindling stockpiles of fuel and ammunition, with many divisions reporting daily consumption levels far exceeding resupply capacity. The encirclement was not yet complete, but the stage was set for the full closure of the pocket and the subsequent German attempt to break free from western Ukraine. The strategic goals of both sides in the Kamenets-Podolsky campaign reflected the broader priorities of the Eastern Front in spring 1944. For the Soviet High Command, the main objective was to destroy Hube's 1st Panzer Army entirely, thereby crippling Army Group South and eliminating a significant concentration of experienced German formations from the war in Ukraine. The capture of western Ukraine, particularly the roads leading to the Carpathian passes, would allow Soviet forces to press into Romania and Hungary by summer, threatening the Axis oil supplies at Ploiești. To achieve this, Zhukov's 1st Ukrainian Front and Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front were allocated extensive resources, including more than 450,000 troops, nearly 900 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 6,000 artillery pieces, and around 600 combat aircraft. Their planning emphasized rapid maneuver to encircle rather than a slow attritional siege, with armored spearheads ordered to bypass heavy resistance whenever possible and converge west of Kamenets-Podolsky to seal the German forces inside a defined pocket. Soviet logistics were mobilized for this maneuver war. Railway lines from Kiev and Vinnytsia delivered ammunition, fuel, and replacements forward to the front, while engineering units repaired bridges destroyed by retreating Germans to ensure supply continuity. Fuel stocks were prioritized for the mobile units: the 1st Guards Tank Army, 4th Tank Army, and 2nd Tank Army, which together fielded more than 550 operational tanks at the outset of the offensive. Soviet planners also coordinated with the Long-Range Aviation Command to target German depots, bridges, and assembly points, further straining enemy resupply. Despite these preparations, challenges persisted. Muddy spring conditions slowed vehicle movement, and overstretched supply columns occasionally failed to keep pace with the advancing armored spearheads. The German objectives were defensive and focused on preserving the 1st Panzer Army's combat strength while delaying the Soviet advance long enough to re-establish a defensible front along the Carpathian foothills. Hube's command consisted of approximately 200,000 men organized into 18 divisions, including 4 armored formations: the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions, 6th Panzer Division, and 17th Panzer Grenadier Division, as well as several infantry and security divisions. These units collectively had around 150 operational tanks and assault guns at the time of encirclement, but fuel shortages rendered many vehicles immobile. German doctrine stressed mobile defense and counterattacks to keep the Soviets off balance, but Hitler's orders designated several cities, including Kamenets-Podolsky, as Festungen, fortresses, to be held at all costs, which restricted Hube's ability to maneuver and preemptively retreat. German logistical preparations lagged behind Soviet efforts due to partisan disruptions and persistent air interdiction. Rail traffic through Lviv and Ternopil was repeatedly targeted by Soviet aircraft, forcing the Germans to rely on truck convoys along secondary roads. Daily fuel allocations for panzer divisions often amounted to less than 50% of operational requirements, reducing their ability to conduct prolonged counterattacks or breakouts. Ammunition shortages were similarly acute, with some infantry regiments reporting only 50 to 80 rounds per rifleman for sustained engagements. Propaganda efforts within the Wehrmacht attempted to maintain morale, emphasizing that the 1st Panzer Army had previously executed successful withdrawals and that reinforcements from Army Group North Ukraine could eventually relieve the pocket. Both sides made miscalculations. The Soviets underestimated the ability of German armored formations to conduct organized withdrawals even under severe pressure, assuming that encirclement would lead to a rapid collapse similar to Stalingrad. Their reliance on spring roads, often turned into mud by thawing snow, also slowed the encirclement, allowing Hube to retain narrow corridors to the west. The Germans, conversely, overestimated the speed at which Army Group North Ukraine could assemble relief forces. They also placed undue faith in the Festung concept, diverting manpower to static defenses that would later have to be abandoned during the breakout. By late March, both armies were committed to courses of action that made the coming confrontation inevitable. The Soviets concentrated their armored thrusts around Chortkiv and Ternopil to close the encirclement, while Hube prepared contingency plans for a breakout toward the west, despite Hitler's prohibitions. The German plan, codenamed Operation Margaret West, by some corps-level staffs, envisioned abandoning the fortified cities in favor of a mobile, westward thrust to link with relief elements of the 4th Panzer Army near Brody. Each side now stood on the brink of the decisive engagements that would determine whether the 1st Panzer Army would be destroyed or manage to fight its way out of Ukraine. The first major clashes of the encirclement unfolded as Soviet spearheads closed around Kamenets-Podolsky. In the final days of March 1944, the 1st Guards Tank Army, advancing from the north, and the 2nd Tank Army, driving from the south, converged on the road and rail junctions near Dunayevsky and Chortkiv. These nodes were vital for the 1st Panzer Army's lateral movement and supply as they connected its eastern sectors near Proskurov and its western routes toward Ternopil and Lviv. Soviet forward detachments, composed of fast-moving tank brigades and motorized infantry, aimed to seize these positions intact. German rearguards, largely from the 359th Infantry Division and elements of the 6th Panzer Division, fought delaying actions, using anti-tank guns and minefields to slow the Soviet advance despite their limited resources. By 28th March, Soviet forces had secured Dunayevsky and threatened to cut the main Kamenets-Podolsky-Ternopil road. The loss of these junctions signaled the onset of a full-scale encirclement. On 30th March, units of the 1st Ukrainian Front captured Chortkiv, a key southern anchor point, severing the primary supply route along the Seret River. At this point, Hube's 1st Panzer Army was effectively confined within a pocket roughly 45 kilometers east to west and 90 kilometers north to south, encompassing the city of Kamenets-Podolsky and surrounding rural districts. Within the pocket were 18 divisions, including about 200,000 troops, 150 tanks and assault guns, and around 800 field guns. Soviet intelligence reports estimated that the Germans had sufficient fuel for only 2 to 3 days of large-scale movement, while their ammunition reserves varied widely. Armored divisions retained adequate stocks for limited counterattacks, but many infantry regiments were down to fewer than 50 rounds per rifle. For the civilian population, the sudden collapse of German defenses and the rapid Soviet advance produced chaos. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians fled westward alongside retreating German units, fearing reprisals from advancing Soviet forces or forced conscription. Villages along the Seret and Zbruch rivers were caught in crossfire as Soviet artillery targeted German columns moving along the few usable roads. The Red Army, intent on sealing the pocket, prioritized speed over securing occupied settlements, leaving many areas contested and exposed to looting by both retreating German troops and irregular partisan groups. Morale on both sides reflected the intensity of the engagements. Soviet troops, buoyed by recent victories at Kiev and Korsun, viewed the encirclement as another decisive blow that could match or exceed the destruction of German forces at Stalingrad. However, the rapid pace of the advance, coupled with muddy terrain and long supply lines, began to exhaust Soviet infantry and tank crews. German morale, while strained, did not collapse. Hube's leadership emphasized the army's cohesion and previous successful retreats, notably from the Dnieper Line, as proof that a breakout remained possible. Panzer crews, though limited in fuel, prepared to use their mobility in concentrated thrusts to punch through Soviet lines if an escape corridor could be opened. Unexpected developments emerged as the first engagements escalated. Soviet armored thrusts, while successful in cutting roads and isolating German strongpoints, began to suffer from logistical strain by the end of March. Fuel deliveries, reliant on hastily repaired rail lines and vulnerable truck convoys, struggled to keep up with the forward units. Several tank brigades reported operational rates falling below 50% as vehicles were sidelined by mechanical failures or lack of fuel. This temporary slowdown gave the 1st Panzer Army a narrow window to regroup and prepare for coordinated movement rather than a piecemeal collapse. The first week of April saw intensified combat as Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, pressing inward toward Kamenets-Podolsky itself. Artillery duels became constant, with Soviet batteries firing an average of 5,000 shells per day into German defensive zones, while German counter-battery fire, though diminished, focused on disrupting Soviet infantry concentrations and bridge-building efforts across the Zbruch River. Soviet air superiority, with roughly 500 aircraft available to the two fronts, further hampered German attempts to move supplies or evacuate wounded, as Luftwaffe assets in the region had been reduced to fewer than 100 operational planes, mostly fighters and reconnaissance aircraft. By 5th of April, the first engagements had defined the contours of the battle. Hube's army was surrounded but not yet broken. The Soviets had secured control of the critical river crossings and junctions, and both sides were bracing for a prolonged confrontation. The German command began consolidating mobile forces for a breakout attempt, while the Soviets, determined to finish the encirclement, brought forward fresh infantry divisions and artillery to seal every escape route. The stage was set for the next phase of the campaign, where crisis and escalation would test the endurance and resolve of both armies. As April 1944 progressed, the confrontation in the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket escalated into a full crisis for both armies. For Hube's 1st Panzer Army, survival depended on maintaining cohesion across a shrinking perimeter, while Soviet forces sought to apply constant pressure to force surrender or destruction. The encircled German divisions, numbering around 200,000 men with 150 tanks, now faced a tightening ring of over 450,000 Soviet troops, backed by 900 armored vehicles, more than 6,000 artillery pieces, and near-total air superiority. The fighting intensified along the Zbruch River and in the rolling countryside west of Kamenets-Podolsky, where muddy terrain and spring floods complicated maneuver and supply for both sides. Soviet reinforcements, arriving in early April, allowed Zhukov and Konev to rotate forward infantry divisions, keeping up continuous attacks along the German perimeter. The 1st Guards Tank Army spearheaded multiple thrusts toward key crossroads at Horodenka and Borshchiv, while the 4th Tank Army targeted the routes leading north toward Brody. These moves aimed to prevent any organized German breakout while compressing the pocket into a narrower, more defensible area for the Red Army to bombard and overrun. Artillery barrages intensified, with Soviet batteries firing over 20,000 shells daily by mid-April, systematically targeting bridges, river crossings, and known German assembly areas. Hube's command, meanwhile, faced immense logistical strain. Fuel stocks had dwindled to fewer than 20,000 liters across the entire army by the 2nd week of April, enough for only 1 or 2 concentrated armored thrusts. Ammunition shortages grew severe, with several infantry regiments reporting no more than 30 to 40 rounds per rifleman and relying on captured Soviet munitions whenever possible. Food rations dropped to minimal levels, particularly for non-combat personnel, as supply convoys were increasingly intercepted by Soviet units or destroyed by airstrikes. The Luftwaffe, with fewer than 100 operational aircraft in the sector, conducted limited supply drops, delivering no more than 100 tons of materiel per day, far below the estimated 400 tons needed to sustain combat operations. The terrain and weather compounded the crisis. The spring thaw turned unpaved roads into mud, immobilizing supply wagons and causing frequent breakdowns among German half-tracks and tanks. River crossings over the Spruk and Seret became choke points as bridges were repeatedly destroyed by Soviet artillery and bombing runs, forcing German engineers to improvise pontoon crossings under fire. Soviet forces, though also slowed by the mud, benefited from shorter supply lines and the ability to use captured German infrastructure to sustain their advance. Political tensions added further complexity. Hitler, issuing directives from Berlin, demanded that Huba hold Kamenets-Podolsky as a fortress to tie down Soviet forces, rejecting repeated requests to authorize an immediate breakout. Von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, supported Huba's appeals, arguing that delay would lead to the destruction of the 1st Panzer Army, but his protests failed to sway Hitler. This delay cost valuable time. Soviet units tightened their encirclement, and by 10th of April, only a single corridor west of the Dniester remained tenuously open, constantly shelled and strafed by Soviet artillery and aircraft. Civilian suffering escalated as the battle intensified. Thousands of local inhabitants were caught in the combat zone, with many pressed into labor by German units to build fortifications or repair roads, while others fled west alongside retreating columns. Soviet partisans, operating in the forests and hills, ambushed isolated German detachments and supply convoys, further weakening Hube's ability to sustain his troops. Entire villages were depopulated, as residents were either evacuated, conscripted, or caught in crossfire between advancing Soviet units and German rearguards. Despite the deteriorating conditions, German discipline and organization held. Huba consolidated his forces into mobile Kampfgruppen, combining remaining armor with infantry and artillery to create flexible units capable of counterattacks and delaying actions. The 1st Panzer and 6th Panzer divisions, though each reduced to fewer than 40 operational tanks, were concentrated to strike at weak points in Soviet lines, buying time for the rest of the army to prepare for a coordinated breakout. Soviet commanders, recognizing the Germans' resilience, reinforced their blocking positions with additional anti-tank regiments and dug in along likely breakout routes, anticipating a final effort by Hube's army to escape. By mid-April, the crisis had reached its peak. The encirclement was nearly complete, German supplies were critically low, and Soviet forces were preparing a final push to annihilate the pocket. Yet the 1st Panzer Army, still cohesive and retaining its armored core, was not prepared to surrender. Huba, defying Hitler's directives in practice if not in words, began covertly planning a breakout operation toward the west, coordinating with elements of the 4th Panzer Army outside the pocket. The stage was set for the largest and most desperate phase of the battle as both sides prepared for the decisive engagements that would determine whether the Wehrmacht could escape Ukraine or suffer destruction. The battle reached its peak between 12 and 20 April 1944, as the fighting around the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket intensified to its highest level of violence. Hube's 1st Panzer Army, compressed into an area less than 40 kilometers wide and 80 kilometers long, faced relentless Soviet pressure from all directions. Soviet forces with over 450,000 troops, approximately 900 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 6,000 artillery pieces, maintained constant assaults to reduce the pocket. The Germans, numbering about 200,000 men with roughly 150 operational armored vehicles, fought to hold a shrinking perimeter while preparing for a coordinated breakout westward toward German lines near Brody and Ternopil. The terrain, mud-choked roads, swollen rivers, and rolling hills, turned every movement into a challenge, amplifying the desperation on both sides. Soviet offensives during this period aimed to divide the pocket into smaller segments for easier destruction. On 14th April, the 1st Guards Tank Army launched a concentrated attack along the Dunayevsky-Horodenka axis, supported by 2 rifle corps and over 400 artillery pieces. Their objective was to bisect Hube's army, severing the northern formations, including the 1st Panzer and 6th Panzer divisions, from the Southern Infantry Corps. German counterattacks, spearheaded by Kampfgruppen formed from the 1st Panzer and 16th Panzer divisions, managed to hold the line despite losing 15 tanks in a single day. Mobile German groups exploited gaps between Soviet spearheads, launching localized counterstrikes to disrupt artillery positions and delay the partition of the pocket. Artillery and air power dominated the engagements. Soviet batteries, firing up to 25,000 shells daily, systematically pounded German assembly areas and river crossings, while the Red Air Force deployed around 500 aircraft, mostly Il-2 Sturmovix and Yak-9 fighters, to interdict supply routes and attack troop concentrations. The Luftwaffe, operating fewer than 80 aircraft in the region, focused on reconnaissance and defensive fighter sweeps, rarely managing to challenge Soviet air superiority. German forces relied heavily on camouflage, night movements, and the cover of forests to avoid annihilation from the air. Despite these measures, ammunition dumps and fuel reserves suffered repeated hits, forcing rationing of artillery shells to no more than 10 rounds per gun per day in some sectors. The civilian population continued to endure severe hardship. Many local Ukrainians, fearing reprisals from both retreating Germans and advancing Soviets, fled into the countryside or attempted to cross the Dniester into regions still under Axis control. Villages near the Zhubruk River were devastated by repeated battles, with homes requisitioned for German field hospitals or destroyed by Soviet artillery. Partisan activity increased, with several Soviet-backed groups attacking isolated German units and disrupting attempts to repair critical bridges needed for the eventual breakout. High command decisions in this phase were decisive. Hube, recognizing that continued static defense would lead to collapse, finalized plans for a breakout toward the northwest. This plan, coordinated with elements of the 4th Panzer Army outside the pocket, called for abandoning Kamenets-Podolsky and other fortified positions to consolidate mobile forces. The breakout would center on a concentrated thrust by the remaining armored divisions, supported by infantry columns in echelon, aiming to cross the Zbruch and Dniester rivers and link with relief forces near Ternopil. Von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, supported the plan, though Hitler's directives still officially forbade relinquishing Kamenets-Podolsky, leading Hube to delay open execution until conditions became untenable. For the Soviets, the priority was to tighten the encirclement and prevent Hube's forces from escaping. Konev redeployed additional anti-tank brigades and rifle divisions to block the likely breakout corridors, while Zhukov concentrated his armor in depth to deliver counterblows should the Germans attempt a massed thrust. Both commanders, however, faced challenges of their own. The spring thaw had slowed their logistics. Fuel and ammunition deliveries struggled to match the pace of operations, and mechanical breakdowns reduced the operational strength of their tank units by nearly a third by mid-April. These difficulties created temporary vulnerabilities in the encirclement, which Hube sought to exploit. By 18th of April, the battles reached their most intense stage. German forces, using their remaining armor and artillery in concentrated attacks, began to push westward in preparation for the breakout, while Soviet units pressed inward with repeated assaults to prevent any escape. Civilian refugees clogged roads alongside retreating German columns, often coming under Soviet fire. Casualties mounted rapidly. German reports indicated daily losses exceeding 1,500 men, while Soviet casualties from constant attacks against entrenched positions and counterstrikes reached similar levels. The peak of the campaign had arrived, with both armies locked in a struggle where the outcome would determine the fate of the 1st Panzer Army and the control of western Ukraine. As the 1st Panzer Army braced for its breakout, the final days of April 1944 became a period of forced adaptation and improvisation on both sides. Hube's forces, still numbering about 200,000 men, but now compressed into a corridor only 30 kilometers wide, relied on flexible Kampfgruppen formations to maintain cohesion. These mixed groups of infantry, armor, and artillery allowed the Germans to counter Soviet probes, screen their vulnerable columns, and preserve mobility despite severe shortages of fuel and ammunition. Many units cannibalized damaged vehicles for spare parts, converted trucks into improvised armored carriers, and redistributed their last fuel reserves to priority vehicles, mainly tanks and artillery tractors needed to spearhead the westward thrust. The panzer divisions, particularly the 1st and 6th, adapted their tactics to the deteriorating conditions. With only about 60 operational tanks combined, they shifted from large-scale offensive maneuvers to localized counterattacks and blocking actions, conserving their strength for the breakout. Infantry units, such as the 68th and 291st Infantry Divisions, were reorganized into mobile march columns supported by horse-drawn artillery to maintain speed on mud-bound roads. Engineers became critical, repairing roads and bridges destroyed by Soviet forces and laying temporary crossings over the Zbruch and Dniester rivers, often under constant shell fire. German communications emphasized strict march discipline as any congestion risked catastrophic losses from Soviet artillery and airstrikes. Soviet forces also adjusted their approach, recognizing that Hube's army would attempt a concentrated breakout rather than a static defense. Zhukov and Konev redeployed several rifle divisions to form successive blocking lines west of Kamenets-Podolsky, particularly near Horodenka and the approaches to Ternopil. Anti-tank brigades were concentrated along likely German thrust routes, while mobile reserves, elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army, were held behind the lines to deliver counterstrikes once the Germans committed to their escape corridor. Soviet artillery shifted to interdiction fire, targeting river crossings, choke points, and night marches. Air operations intensified, with up to 300 sorties per day by Il-2 Sturmovix and PE-2 bombers, disrupting German columns and further depleting their limited fuel stocks. The psychological toll on both armies became evident. German troops, though disciplined, endured constant exhaustion from round-the-clock marches and combat. Food rations were reduced to little more than 200 grams of bread and occasional meat per day, leading to widespread malnutrition and fatigue. Soviet soldiers, for their part, faced relentless combat in difficult terrain, often advancing through flooded fields and mud while sustaining heavy casualties from German ambushes and artillery. Both sides contended with the brutal spring conditions, which left entire sectors bogged down, vehicles abandoned, and supply lines overstretched. Partisan activity surged during this phase, further complicating the battle. Soviet-aligned partisans, operating in the forests near the Dniester, ambushed German supply columns and relayed intelligence on troop movements to Red Army commanders. These attacks forced Hube to divert several battalions to rear area security, reducing the combat strength available for the breakout effort. Civilians, caught between the warring armies, fled en masse toward areas perceived as safer, often congesting the very roads the 1st Panzer Army needed to keep clear for movement. Many were pressed into labor to help build roads and carry supplies, adding to the chaos along the retreat routes. Innovation and resource management became defining characteristics of the German effort to survive. Improvised fuel caches were established by draining fuel from abandoned vehicles, while artillery shells were redistributed so that priority batteries could continue operating at reduced capacity. Damaged tanks were stripped of machine guns and repurposed as stationary defensive strongpoints, covering the flanks of march routes. Mobile workshops worked day and night to keep as many vehicles operational as possible, while medical units consolidated into central clearing stations to treat thousands of wounded soldiers and civilians under constant threat of bombardment. Soviet forces, despite their numerical and material superiority, faced their own limitations. The rapid tempo of operations strained their logistics, with some rifle divisions reporting shortages of ammunition and rations by the third week of April. Tank brigades, heavily engaged in blocking actions, suffered mechanical attrition as the muddy terrain destroyed suspensions and engines, reducing operational readiness by nearly 40% in some units. These logistical strains prevented the Red Army from sealing the pocket as quickly as planned, creating the gaps Hube intended to exploit. By 22nd April, the stage was set for the breakout. Hube's forces, reorganized into three main columns with armored spearheads at the front and rear, prepared to punch through the Soviet encirclement along the Horodenka-Bukak axis. Both sides had adapted their strategies for the final phase. The Germans marshaled every remaining resource for speed and concentration, while the Soviets fortified successive defensive belts and prepared to counterattack. The outcome would hinge on whether Hube could move fast enough through the mud and hostile fire to reach the positions of the 4th Panzer Army before the Soviets could close the trap for good. The turning point of the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket came between 23 and 30 April 1944, when Hube's 1st Panzer Army initiated its breakout toward the west. After weeks of attrition and near-total encirclement, the German command concentrated its remaining combat power into three coordinated march columns, each led by the surviving armored elements of the 1st, 6th, and 16th Panzer Divisions. Together, these divisions fielded fewer than 70 operational tanks and assault guns, supported by roughly 150 field and anti-tank guns. Infantry divisions, including the 68th, 291st, and 101st Jaeger, were formed into mobile groups, many relying on horse-drawn transport to maintain pace with the armored spearheads. Hube's strategy emphasized speed and cohesion. Each column would advance along parallel routes toward the Horodenka-Bukak axis, cross the Dniester River, and link with elements of the 4th Panzer Army advancing from the west near Ternopil. The breakout began on 23 April under the cover of darkness, with German units abandoning fixed positions in Kamenets-Podolsky and surrounding towns. Engineers constructed makeshift bridges across the Zbruch River, while rearguard units, primarily from the 359th Infantry Division and ad hoc formations, fought delaying actions to hold Soviet forces at bay. Soviet reconnaissance quickly detected the withdrawal, prompting Zhukov and Konev to order immediate pursuit and blocking actions. The Red Army deployed additional rifle divisions to choke the exit routes, while the 1st Guards Tank Army and elements of the 4th Tank Army moved to intercept the advancing columns before they could reach the Dniester. The ensuing battles were characterized by near-constant movement and repeated clashes at river crossings, villages, and road junctions. On 25th April, near Horodenka, the leading elements of the 1st Panzer Division clashed with Soviet blocking forces, including 2 rifle divisions and supporting anti-tank units. German armor, despite fuel shortages, executed concentrated assaults to punch holes in the Soviet line, losing 12 tanks in the process, but opening a corridor wide enough for infantry columns to pass. Soviet artillery and air power inflicted heavy casualties on the congested roads, with Il-2 Sturmovik sorties destroying dozens of vehicles and disrupting the orderly movement of supply wagons. Nevertheless, disciplined march organization and the use of night movements allowed the Germans to sustain their westward advance. Civilian and non-combatant presence along the breakout routes complicated the fighting. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians, fearing reprisals or deportations, fled alongside German columns, adding to traffic jams and drawing Soviet fire. German military police attempted to clear roads to maintain movement, often forcibly dispersing civilian groups to prevent bottlenecks. Soviet forces, focused on halting the breakout, showed little restraint in shelling roadways and crossings, further increasing civilian casualties and disorganization among retreating German units. By 27 April, The breakout columns reached the Dniester River, where Soviet forces had destroyed most permanent bridges. German engineers, operating under constant fire, erected pontoon bridges and ferries to move troops and vehicles across. The crossings took place over several nights, with panzer formations and artillery moving first to secure bridgeheads on the western bank. Soviet counterattacks, including armored thrusts by elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army, attempted to sever the columns at the river, but German rearguards, supported by the remaining tanks of the 6th Panzer Division, repelled these efforts long enough for the bulk of Hube's forces to cross. The momentum shifted decisively in the final days of April. Although Soviet forces maintained pressure and inflicted significant losses, German records indicate over 15,000 casualties during the breakout, alongside the destruction or abandonment of hundreds of vehicles. The 1st Panzer Army avoided destruction. By 30th April, the 3 march columns had linked with advance elements of the 4th Panzer Army near Buchach, establishing a tenuous but functioning corridor for continued retreat toward Lviv and the Carpathian foothills. For the Soviets, the failure to annihilate Hube's army was a significant setback despite territorial gains. The Red Army had liberated most of western Ukraine east of the Dniester and inflicted substantial losses on the Wehrmacht. But the survival of 18 divisions allowed the Germans to reconstitute a defensive line along the Carpathians and delay the Soviet advance into Central Europe. The breakout demonstrated the capacity of the Wehrmacht, even in retreat and under severe material disadvantage, to conduct organized, large-scale maneuver warfare. This turning point marked the transition from a battle of encirclement to one of withdrawal and pursuit, setting the stage for the final phase of the campaign. By early May 1944, active combat around Kamenets-Podolsky had largely transitioned from a static encirclement to a mobile withdrawal as Hube's 1st Panzer Army, though battered, continued to retreat toward Lviv and the defensive lines along the Carpathian foothills. The breakout, executed between 23 and 30 April, had cost the Germans over 15,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing, and the abandonment of hundreds of vehicles and large stores of equipment. However, the survival of approximately 180,000 men, organized into 18 divisions, allowed the Wehrmacht to preserve a significant fighting force in Ukraine. The retreat unfolded in stages as German columns reorganized on the western bank of the Dniester and pressed toward the fortified positions being prepared near Brody and Ternopil. The Red Army, though it failed to destroy Hube's forces outright, maintained pursuit to prevent them from consolidating. Elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army pushed westward, targeting road junctions and rail lines critical to the German withdrawal. Soviet infantry divisions advanced methodically, clearing abandoned German strongpoints and capturing depots filled with supplies that could not be evacuated during the breakout. Yet logistical and operational strains slowed the Soviet pursuit. Many of their armored units were suffering from mechanical attrition and fuel shortages after weeks of near-continuous operations, reducing their ability to mount rapid follow-up thrusts. This allowed the 1st Panzer Army to maintain a relatively orderly retreat despite periodic clashes. The withdrawal itself was marked by near-constant skirmishes. German rearguards, often consisting of Kampfgruppen, formed from depleted infantry divisions supported by a few tanks or assault guns, conducted delaying actions at river crossings, forests, and small towns. These actions bought time for the bulk of Hube's forces to continue moving west, though they frequently resulted in heavy casualties as Soviet artillery and air power struck retreating columns. German engineers remained central to the retreat, building temporary bridges and repairing roads under fire to keep supply lines functioning. Despite these efforts, significant quantities of heavy equipment, including artillery, trucks, and immobile tanks, had to be destroyed or abandoned to avoid capture. Civilians bore severe consequences during the final phase of the operation. Many villages along the retreat routes were left devastated, either by Soviet bombardment or by German scorched earth measures intended to slow the Red Army. Thousands of local inhabitants were displaced, with some forcibly evacuated by retreating German forces to work as laborers behind the front, while others were conscripted into Soviet labor battalions once the Red Army secured the area. Starvation, disease, and reprisals became widespread as military priorities overrode humanitarian concerns on both sides. By mid-May, the surviving formations of the 1st Panzer Army had linked fully with Army Group North Ukraine near Brody. The retreat, though costly, prevented a Stalingrad-like disaster and preserved experienced German divisions that would later participate in defensive battles across Galicia and the Carpathians. The Germans established a new defensive line stretching from Lviv to the foothills of the Carpathians, buying critical time to reinforce their positions before the Red Army could mount another major offensive. For the Soviets, the aftermath represented a mixed outcome. While the Red Army had liberated most of western Ukraine east of the Carpathians and inflicted heavy losses on the Wehrmacht, the escape of Huba's army denied them the chance to eliminate a major German force in one blow. Soviet casualties, though not precisely documented for this phase, were substantial, with many divisions reporting losses exceeding 20% of their initial strength due to combat, disease, and exhaustion during the prolonged encirclement and pursuit. The logistical demands of the operation also left both the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts in need of resupply and rest before continuing deeper into Eastern Europe. The immediate consequences for the region were profound. Infrastructure across western Ukraine had been heavily damaged, bridges destroyed, roads churned into mud by weeks of heavy traffic, and towns like Kamenets-Podolsky, Chortkiv, and Dunayevsky left in ruins. Agricultural production, already crippled by years of occupation and warfare, was further disrupted, leading to widespread shortages. Refugee flows surged as civilians sought safety in newly secured Soviet territories, or fled west with retreating German forces, reshaping the demographic landscape of the region in the war's closing years. Though the battle's direct combat operations had ended, its repercussions would continue to unfold. The retreat of the 1st Panzer Army into Galicia ensured that fighting would soon shift closer to the borders of Poland and Hungary, while the devastated Ukrainian countryside faced the dual burden of recovery and the imposition of Soviet military administration. The Kamenets-Podolsky campaign had entered its final chapter, leaving behind a scarred region and setting the stage for the last phase of the struggle over Eastern Europe in 1944. The Battle of the Kamenets-Podolsky Pocket, though less renowned than Stalingrad or Kursk, carried significant historical weight for the course of the Eastern Front in 1944. Its outcome shaped both the military trajectory of the Wehrmacht and the strategic progress of the Red Army as the war moved toward Central Europe. For Germany, the survival of the 1st Panzer Army, despite the loss of over 15,000 men and extensive materiel, preserved 18 combat divisions that would later form the backbone of Army Group North Ukraine's defensive lines in Galicia and along the Carpathians. These divisions, though heavily depleted, provided experienced cadres for rebuilding the German front, allowing the Wehrmacht to slow the Soviet advance during the summer campaigns, particularly in battles around Brody and Lviv. For the Soviet Union, the battle underscored both the successes and limitations of its operational doctrine in 1944. The Red Army liberated nearly all of western Ukraine east of the Carpathians, inflicted severe losses on a major German formation, and demonstrated its capacity to conduct large-scale encirclement operations across difficult terrain. Yet the failure to annihilate Hube's army revealed logistical and coordination challenges that continued to constrain Soviet offensives. The spring mud, overstretched supply lines, and mechanical attrition among armored units slowed the final closure of the pocket, granting the Germans the time and space needed for their breakout. The campaign became a case study in the importance of sustaining operational momentum in encirclement battles, influencing Soviet planning for later operations such as Bagration and the push into the Balkans. Politically and socially, the battle's legacy was marked by widespread devastation and transformation in western Ukraine. The region, already ravaged by 3 years of occupation, suffered massive infrastructural damage. Key urban centers, including Kamenets-Podolsky, Dunayevtsi, and Chortkiev, were left heavily damaged or depopulated by the fighting. Agricultural production, critical for both local populations and the Soviet war economy, was severely disrupted, with many fields abandoned or destroyed during the retreat and counteroffensives. Civilian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, including those killed in crossfire, executed as suspected collaborators, or displaced during forced evacuations by both sides. The battle intensified the cycle of displacement, with thousands of Ukrainians deported by retreating German forces as laborers and others forcibly integrated into Soviet partisan and reconstruction efforts. Commemoration and historical debate regarding the Kamenets-Podolsky operation emerged in later decades. In Soviet historiography, the battle was portrayed as a demonstration of the Red Army's growing operational mastery, often emphasizing the liberation of Ukrainian territory while downplaying the failure to fully destroy the 1st Panzer Army. German accounts, particularly post-war memoirs by officers like Hubes, Staff, and Manstein, framed the breakout as an example of Wehrmacht professionalism and resilience, sometimes casting it as a second Dunkirk in terms of escape under dire circumstances. Modern scholarship tends to present a more balanced view, acknowledging both the Soviet strategic success in reclaiming vast territories and the German achievement in preserving a large field army despite encirclement. In military studies, the battle is frequently cited as an illustration of the adaptability of both armies during the later stages of the Eastern Front. For the Wehrmacht, it highlighted the effectiveness of mobile, combined arms Kampfgruppen, disciplined march organization, and experienced leadership in facilitating retreats under pressure. For the Red Army, it reinforced the need for reliable logistics, coordination between armor and infantry, and flexible operational planning to capitalize fully on encirclement opportunities. Lessons from Kamenets-Podolsky informed subsequent operations on both sides, shaping how the remaining campaigns of 1944 unfolded in Ukraine, Poland, and the Balkans.